Hey everyone, welcome back. Before this video starts, I just want to let everyone know that I've got a new schedule. I'm going to be uploading a minimum of at least 2 videos a week, so expect a lot more content than I've ever made before. So if you enjoy this channel or the videos that I make sure you subscribe so you're notified every time I upload. But anyway, if it's in the title above, you can probably tell this video is about YouTube podcasts. And more specifically, I'm going to give you my top 5 podcasts that I listen to every single day. Now, I listen to podcasts every single day at work. Now, what makes a fantastic podcast for me is when I'm at work and I can just listen to a podcast. I can just zone out and think about nothing besides what the people are saying. And honestly, if you're doing something boring like driving a car, painting, or house chores or something like that, listening to a podcast makes the time go so much quicker. But anyway, now I'm going to show you the top 5 podcasts which I think are the best. Alright, so coming in at number 5 has got to be this big, bold, beautiful man, Joe Rogan. Honestly, I think it's expected to find Joe Rogan on any list that's talking about great podcasters. The thing that I love about Joe Rogan is that he produces so much content. All the other podcasts on this list probably upload about once or twice a week, but Joe Rogan uploads a podcast pretty much every single day. Not to mention, pretty much every podcast is about 2 hours or 3 hours long, so you will never ever run out of content. I also respect Joe Rogan because he doesn't speak down upon anyone. He's extremely respectable about everyone, but most importantly, he's so educated in everyone he brings to his podcast. In terms of being professional, there's no one that even comes close to being as professional as Joe Rogan when it comes to podcasts. However, to me, the only reason he's not in position number 1 is because yes, it's an interesting podcast, but it's not exciting. If we sit there and listen to multiple podcasts in a row, I do tend to get really bored. So in reality, I kind of use Joe Rogan's podcast as like a backup podcast if I've got nothing else to listen to. Again, credit where credit's due. Joe Rogan does make a pretty damn good podcast, but for me, it's a bit dull. And with that said, let's move on. Alright, so coming in at 4th place has got to be True Geordi. Now, when it comes to production value, the True Geordi podcast blows all of its competition just out of the water. The production value is top notch. Before I briefly go into detail into this podcast, I've just got to say that my favourite podcast that I've ever listened to is 100% True Geordi's David Icke podcast.
If you said to most people, it still is most people, how many buildings came down on 9/11? They'd say 2. Go on the internet and you put in building 7 collapse or whatever, you will see the most obvious controlled demolition you'll ever see.
There's some people who think that they were drones.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, God, yes. There were 84 cameras in and around the Pentagon, which we've never seen.
Now, the reason why I love this podcast so much is because Brian nailed this. He allowed David to talk and explain himself and didn't put any pressure on him despite other people just saying that David's a lunatic. He wasn't narrow-minded and he listened to what David was saying. And to just allow David Icke to talk for 3 hours, it was one of the most interesting things I think I've ever heard in my life. And that's honestly just down to Brian and Lawrence being the best podcast team they could be. These two together, they're just so funny. It's like, you know, they're trying to be serious, but Lawrence just can't help it. He just slips up with stupid stuff to make himself laugh. And that sets Brian off, and I don't know, it's just funny. And because it's kind of half-hearted in a way, when the guests come on the show, they're so open and they feel comfortable. They really open up, thanks to Lawrence and Brian being such good hosts, and they pretty much end up answering every question I could even think of. So far, it sounds pretty damn good, right? You might be thinking, okay, so if it's that good of a podcast, why have I put it into position 4, not 1? Well, the answer is pretty simple. You remember like a year ago where Brian's DMs got released to the world? Basically became a laughingstock, and then on top of that, his main sponsor ditched him. Brian and Lawrence and their team pretty much lost nearly everything, and that was all mainly because of just how Brian was as a person. Personally, I prefer this Brian because it reminds me more of real life people. Like, the way he used to speak is exactly how people would speak to me at work on like construction sites. Brian was like an actual geezer. Just watch this clip and tell me if this isn't funny, because I think it's hilarious.
Chat would definitely achieve.
What I would do is bend her over.
Good God.
Shove the dick in to the cunt.
To the cunt.
In the mirror. Doggy style, right? So then you can get a good shot of her face
I don't want any
moaning
part of this.
as you are giving her the dick.
See, and that's the problem. Brian doesn't talk like that because he can't get away with it anymore. I don't have anything against Brian or Lawrence for making that change and becoming a little bit more PC for their advertisers, because that had to happen no matter what. All I'm saying is the reason why they're not higher up on this list is because if I was to choose a true Geordi podcast, I'd 100% choose any of the older ones over the newer ones.
This one's called School Dance.
Oh, very romantic.
I like this girl and she likes me. Oh.
Good for you, cunt.
To me, it's way more enjoyable when you have Brian saying ridiculous stuff like this.
We'll do the final Twitter topic.
Yeah.
Someone said, what would it be like if Geordi and Lawrence were a gay couple?
Painful.
For you.
Yeah.
And then the podcast he makes now where they're a bit more serious and they're talking about like serious issues, and the guests they bring on, they're talking about like emotions and stuff. I don't know, it's just quite, well, playing it safe, like they're being sensitive towards people's emotions. But like I said, I completely understand literally the reasons why they've done that. But for me, the reason why this podcast is on this list is because their older videos are A-star. They are brilliant. Which brings me on to my next podcast that reminds me of the early days of True Geordi. Alright, so coming into third place, this may surprise you, but in my opinion, it's the Waffling podcast by Joe Weller. Now, if you want a podcast that's there to make you laugh and not take anything seriously, this is definitely the podcast for you. This podcast is basically three really good friends having a laugh. One of the things that I love about this podcast is that a lot of podcasts rely on their guests, but Waffling doesn't really have guests. It's more about banter between Luke, Theo Baker and Joe. Now, to be honest, you'd only like this podcast if you like the hosts, as it's mainly about them. Now, here's the thing. I don't like Theo Baker's or Joe Weller's content. I didn't really care for them that much. But honestly, after listening to the Waffling podcast, I realised that these three lads, their sound, like the banter between them, it's just so real. When I listen to this podcast, it reminds me of me with my boys. If you're English, you'd understand why this podcast is so funny. It's just like talking to your friends. They're talking about sex, girls, alcohol, and just being real with each other. And realism is like the new wave on YouTube. What I love as well is that they actually interact with their fans. They respond to the questions that they get all the time in every single episode. Just overall, it's got a really humble community spirit around the Waffling podcast. And overall, the only downside I can really think of is the fact that they just don't upload enough. I mean, the date I'm recording this is the 25th of July, and the last time they uploaded a podcast on Apple Music was on the 12th of July. That's one day off waiting for 2 weeks for another podcast, and that's just too long for me. If they got a schedule where uploading about 2 podcasts a week, it'd be a 10 out of 10 podcast. However, at the moment, for me, it's going to stay in position number 3. Alright, so coming into position 2, this could be controversial, but if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'd realise I don't care. In position 2, it's gotta be Impulsive. Now, despite what you may think of Logan Paul, his podcast is actually very good if you give it a try. Now, the podcast has a similar setup to Waffling, as we have 3 hosts. Of course, we have Logan Paul, we have Mike Malak, and we have Mac. Now, what's great about this podcast is that all 3 of these guys, they're not all the same. They all have different opinions to one another. However, they discuss them and they always come to a common ground. And even though they have different opinions, they're not scared to share it, because no matter what, the main focus of this podcast is comedy. However, it's not like Waffling where it is just all a piss take. The production value of Impulsive is actually very good. It is a professional podcast. It's very well done. And it shows. I mean, look at the guests they get in. One week they have Ben Shapiro talking about politics, and yet they still managed to make it entertaining.
If you don't cut that out, I'll send you home in an ambulance. To which I have to say, my first mental response was, that doesn't even make sense. You don't go home in an ambulance. But
why did you say that? You should have said that. Why did you say that?
But then the next they have someone as crazy as Dan Pena.
And what the current generation does not do, will not do, and in my judgment, cannot do, is pull the fucking trigger. Make a fucking decision, you cunt.
Well said, Dan Pena.
Regardless of who they have on or what they're talking about, they always manage to make their podcast extremely entertaining. And honestly, this podcast made me look at Logan Paul differently. Start to realize that Logan Paul is not actually an idiot at all. He's actually a very smart guy. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that too much. I'm going to talk about why I like Impulsive. And for me, Impulsive is actually very important for making my YouTube channel. Now, people don't know this, but I work a full-time job, which means that I don't have a lot of free time. Now, making YouTube videos can be really hard for me because when you're busy working 40 hours per week, your creativity is kind of sucked away because you're just so tired. However, when I listen to Impulsive, it just inspires me to carry on. I share the exact same enthusiasm that Logan and Mike does. They're both talking about wanting to create content and just smash through everything and achieve their goals. And from hearing where Mike came from, from his drug addict past, and he says if you want to get to somewhere, you have to work and grind. The same as Logan, he's worked for what he's achieved. When I hear that on their podcast when I'm at work, I don't want to get home and just go to sleep. I just want to get home and make videos and just grind harder than anyone that I know. For me, Impulsive is extremely important because it really does inspire me to achieve my goals, and I recommend that you listen to this podcast if you want the same. It really can be inspiring, and then at the same time it can be a right laugh. But anyway, whatever you may think of Logan Paul, whatever you've heard, Impulsive is a damn good podcast, and it's actually very close between this podcast and the podcast that I put into position number 1. Alright, so coming in first place, which I believe to be the best YouTube podcast, is Jackmate's Happy Hour.
Hello guys and welcome back to Jackmate's Happy Hour.
Now, for me, I think this is the perfect podcast. Especially if you love English humour, then this is 100% the podcast for you. Now, I'll be honest, you won't really understand why it's funny unless you're a little bit older. If you are probably in your late teens or early 20s, you'll find Jack's wittiness just unbearably funny. And what I love about Happy Hour is it's just not PC at all. It's such a breath of fresh air when you get people that just don't care and they'll make a joke about nonsense.
The unconscious girl
so hot.
in this room,
sorry.
horrible.
Not the story. It's really hot in this room.
Keep talking, keep talking. How old was she? Quick!
Literally rip into the people, like the guests who are directly in front of them. It's such a realist podcast, like there's no falseness at all. And like I said about the guests, they can have their serious talks with the guests, or the host can just rip into them and just say why they're a knobhead. Honestly, it's so refreshing when someone just does not care about PC culture. And then to add on top of that, the actual podcasts that they make are really entertaining. Personally, I prefer it when it's just Alfie, Stevie and Jack, or Fiona, depending on who's on. And yeah, sorry, I won't forget to mention Robbie Knox, or even I'm Alex, or Duty Rhino. There's like a community spirit, like they're all a tight-knit group of friends. Don't know why it's so interesting when they make videos about conspiracy theories or like urban legends. It's just amazing to see when like you've got people that hear like this urban legend and most YouTubers would say, oh my god, that's crazy. On the Happy Hour, Jackmate would just sit there and say, mate, that was shit. That links into the whole podcast itself. They do listen to their audience when we say that we want to see this episode or give them suggestions on what they could talk about. They will listen to us, but at the end of the day, the content itself doesn't change for anyone else. It's them having fun with it. Because they're treating it as if it's a hobby, not a job. When they upload a new podcast onto Apple Music, I don't even read the title. It's the only podcast that I just listen to because I know either way, whatever it's about, I'm just going to enjoy it. And I don't know, it's very difficult for me to explain why I love this podcast so much. I've literally written this script for this part of the video 3 times now. It's been like 10 pages. I don't know, it could be the charm that it's just not commercial at all. I don't know what it is, but it really lives up to its name. When I listen to a Happy Hour podcast, I'm always laughing and smiling when I'm at work. I seriously have no complaints at all about how they interview people. I can't complain about the production quality. I can't complain about people that are running the show. It's it's just a perfect podcast. And honestly, you can tell they have no idea how good their podcast actually is because they have no ego at all. However, I will be honest, there's only one slight thing that I don't like about the Happy Hour podcast, and that's the football talk. I've actually seen comments agreeing with me saying that basically nobody cares about the football. Most people that subscribe to Jackmate or his podcast, you know, we're not interested in football, we're interested in them. We're interested in getting to know the guests and hosts a lot. If we want to listen to football, we'd head over to True Geordi's Kickoff. But despite that, if that is my only complaint, that's a damn good podcast you have on your hands. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been very different to the stuff I've made before. Honestly, I'm not expecting this video to do too good. However, if you did watch this video and all the way to the end, you are a G. If you did get all the way to the end of this video, make sure you type down in the comments, meal deal. Anyway guys, if you are new, make sure you subscribe. I really need to hit 1,000 subscribers as it will change my YouTube experience. I'll be able to do this so much more seriously. If I get to 1,000 subscribers, I will hopefully be able to upload about 5 videos per week. But anyway, if you have any video suggestions or anything you might want to see, comment down below and I'll make sure I get back to you. On that note, I hope you enjoyed this video. Peace!